Chapter 2. The Longing for Rebirth. The idea of a second birth is found at all times and in all places. Young. In his unconscious, every one of us is convinced of his own immortality. Man is... that's Freud. Man is finite, limited creature, but he holds infinity within him, and he demands infinity as an end. Bradiev. The hope of rebirth or returning to consciousness after death or between deaths has always obsessed us. Freud calls belief in a future life the oldest, strongest, and most insistent wish of mankind. According to Jung, rebirth is an affirmation that must be counted on among the primordial affirmations of mankind. Tribal societies of the plains, mountain, desert, and valley dwellers, inhabitants of jungles, forests, and remote spits of land, all have independently created mythic systems guaranteeing return to consciousness. The idea of an indestructible, travelling soul springs up everywhere. The Dakota, Huron, Mojave, and Natchez Indians of North America, Eskimos, the Carib, Mayan, and Patagonian tribes of Central and South America, the Akawans, Papuans, Melanesians, Fijians, and Dayaks of Borneo react to the prospect of oblivion with the same overriding faith that they will live on in some fashion. So do the tribes of Australia and the islands nearby, Aruntas, Kadeas, Warramunga, Tasman, the Duruses of Lebanon, the millions in Bengal and Burma, in Africa, the Mandingo, Yoruba, Zulus, Bantus, Buritsi. In Europe, the idea of reincarnation came up against the Mediterranean orthodoxies, which hold out the prospect of saving the single existence rather than continuing on through a succession of rebirths. Still, in the north, there may be found among the Finns, Lapps, Danes, Norse, and Celts of Gaul, Wales, England, and Ireland, old Prussians, and early Teutons, the conviction that they have lived other lives and will be born again. Jung lists 5 types of rebirth imagined by mankind. Metempsychosis, transmigration of the souls, continuing of personality not guaranteed. Reincarnation, rebirth in bodily form. Resurrection, renewal in our lifetime, sometimes by means of ceremony. And participation in the process of transformation. This indirect rebirth is achieved in ceremonies like the Mass. The roll call of genius responding to these various forms of revival is virtually endless. At random, begin with Plato's account of Socrates' death in the Phaedo. About to take the hemlock, Socrates will not envision the end of his own being. There comes to mind an ancient doctrine which affirms that the souls of men after death go from hence into the other world, and returning hither are born again from the dead. Centuries later, Saint Augustine asked, Say, Lord, to me, say, did my infancy succeed another age of mine that died before it? Was it that which I spent within my mother's womb, and what before that life again? O God, my joy, was I anywhere or in any body? In the Quran it is written, God generates beings and sends them back over and over again. The Egyptians, more obsessive than anyone in their pursuit of resurrection, filled the Book of the Dead with such boasts as, Homage to thee, O Governor, who makest mortals to be born again, who renewest thy youth. I am yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and I have the power to be born a second time. I have knit together my bones, I have made myself whole and sound. I have become young once more. I am Osiris, the Lord of eternity. Of the great orthodoxies, the Jewish religion has the least to say about rebirth, but in Judaism's underground stream of thought, carried forward in the Kabbalistic works, the theme reoccurs, as set forth in the Zohar. All souls are subject to the trials of transmigration, and men do not know the designs of the Most High with regard to them. They do not know how they are being at all times judged, both before coming into this world and when they leave it. They do not know how many transformations and mysterious trials they must undergo. How many souls and spirits come to this world without returning to the palace of the Divine King? For Luther, in the words of Norman Brown, hell is not a place, but it is an experience of death. It is the hope of a joyful resurrection that alone saves Luther from the dominion of death. Unbelievers, too, voice their longing to live, and thus spoke Zarathustra. Nietzsche vowed, "Oh, and could I not be ardent for eternity, and for the marriage ring of rings, the ring of the return." The most ironic have found some excuse on which to base their hopes for continued consciousness. Voltaire, for one, the doctrine of metempsychosis is, above all, neither absurd nor useless. It is no more surprising to be born twice than once. Everything in nature is resurrection. One of the coolest atheists who ever lived, the Marquis de Sade, has his dying man mock an attending priest. But coming out from behind the irony, we hear, "Nothing dies, my friend. Nothing in this world is destroyed. Today a man, tomorrow a worm, the day after a fly. Is that not always existing?" The Transcendentalists, of course, are open to any suggestion. Thoreau passed along the story of a strong and beautiful bug, which was said to have eaten its way out of a tree hundreds of years old, and hatched perchance by the heat of an urn. The report has gone the rounds of New England, and hearing it, who does not feel his faith in a resurrection and immortality strengthened? At all times, personal immortality is what we are after. Anonymous suggested to a peasant that there might be a god in the form of a universal consciousness, but that man's soul may not be immortal. The peasant replied, "Then wherefore God? Why fight death? All the advanced thinkers keep telling us not to. Advice comes from such counselors as Alan Watts to accept our disappearance into the void as part of life. But with what complacency this counsel can be offered. Watts argues, for example, that the attempt to triumph over death by miracle of resurrection is the failure to see that these pairs are not alternatives but correlatives. In another passage, our unfortunate destiny, personal annihilation, is disposed of as meaninglessness. Now, this is what we fear, the loss of human identity and integrity in the transient stream of atoms. Anxiety results from nothing more than the frustration of not being able to live without death, that is, of not being able to solve a nonsensical problem. Such assurances have a ring of wisdom, but may even be momentarily consoling. Yet somehow the cool view of approaching oblivion seems a bit unreal. Death is nonsense, but it will not be experienced as a nonsensical problem by you or me, or by the philosopher himself, who probably moans when he has toothache like anybody else, but who, when his time comes, will in all likelihood struggle just as frantically to keep his head out of the black sack. In contrast to the general run of wise men, Anonimo cried out with no reservation or shame, "For me, becoming other than I am, the breaking of the unity and the continuing of my life, is to cease to be who I am." That is to say, it is simply to cease to be, and that, no, anything rather than that. There are, of course, loftier philosophical positions. From the vantage point of the Himalayas, We of the West, who cannot stand flies resting on our eyelids, seem hopelessly ego-ridden. Alan Watts sets forth this view. During the era in which Christianity arose, both the Hebrew and the Greco-Roman cultures were much preoccupied with a craving for salvation in terms of individual immortality. Both cultures had developed in such a way as to increase the vivid sense of the ego, of individual isolation, which, ever since, has been so peculiarly characteristic of the Western mentality. But the fear of death can hardly be imagined as particularly Western. Peculiarly? Yeah, okay. But the fear of death can be hardly imagined as peculiarly Western. If this were true, why would tribal societies on every inhabited continent invent all kinds of rebirth systems? And was it not primarily the thought of his own mortal condition that turned the butter away from the world? Promise me that my life will not end in death. He is said to have asked his father that sickness will not impair my health, that age will not follow my youth, that misfortune will not destroy my property. Since his father could not promise these things, the young Buddha decided the world is a prison, and resolved to seek means of leaving it. Since the derivations of Buddhist thought have emphasized that clinging to existence is the source of pain. To avoid pain, give up craving life here. The goal is to exist out of time, beyond life and death, free from craving, suffering, and sorrow. Do not fear death. What dies is only the world of Maya, centered about one's more or less illusory feeling of separate identity. But for all of its subtlety, this ingenious realization of nothingness is a thought game like all others. Finally, in the Lesser, Jerusalem, and Little Rock, everyone pursues the same dream. Reincarnation, resurrection, the arrival of a Messiah, Nirvana, it hardly matters which. East and West have simply come up with varying means of evading oblivion. The difference is that the Asians and their followers give death a judo twist. Jesus Christ. Enabling Eastern man to fling the void over his shoulder by seeming to embrace it. Around the wheel of being, survival has been generally anticipated in one way or another. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna declares, I myself never was not, nor thou, nor all the princes of the earth, nor shall we hereafter cease to be. Also, the man whose devotion has been broken off by death, goeth to the regions of the righteous, where he dwells for an immensity of years, and is born again on earth in a pure and fortunate family. And in China, 6th century BC, from the Chuang-Tzu, the disciple of Lao Tzu, to have attended to the human form must always be a source of joy. Then to undergo countless transitions, with only the infinite to look forward to, what an incomparable bliss is that! It is nature's kindness that we do not remember past births, writes Gandhi to his disciple, Madeline Slade. Where is the good either of knowing in detail the numberless births we have gone through? The form ever changes, ever perishes. The informing spirit neither changes nor perishes. But then, from Gandhi, both birth and death are great mysteries. If death is not a prelude to another life, the intermediate period is a cruel mockery. Freud has said that the unconscious does not believe in its own death. It behaves as if immortal. Jung finds archetypal patterns collectively to be immortal, reaching down to our carbon origins. In Modern Man and Mortality, Jacques Chouan cites the observation made some years ago by psychiatrists Walter Bromberg and Paul Schilder, Paul Schilder, that dreams following an epileptic attack have one specific content. The patient experiences a simulation of death in some form or another. The most common death is followed by a sensation of being reborn. The authors conclude that the rebirth fantasy is part and parcel of the fantasy life of every human being, and that the idea of reincarnation presented by this birth fantasy may be considered as the basic factor in our representation of death. Epileptic outbreaks, therefore, may be understood as violent and faulty reproductions of a natural rhythm. The rhythm is always with us, a continuum of dissolution and renewal, expressed in both dramatic and hardly noticeable forms. The most routine human life, even going to sleep and waking up, moves in obedience to at least faintly experience simulations of death and rebirth. The longing to be reborn rises from the body. It dictates our pleasures and seems recognizably indispensable to emotional health. One senses the presence of an overwhelming cellular need. Failure to move with the death-rebirth rhythm makes us feel out of sorts, despondent, vicious, apparently at regular intervals. Mortal being must go through the reenactment of the dissolving, dying process in order to maintain a zest for life. In combination with this, the involuntary pilgrim puts up with mortality by every now and then knocking himself out of time. But simulated death is the key, or rather the doorway to resurrection and the life. Christ, too, arose out of rhythm of our desire. Repeated imitations of dying and rising once more help recharge our energies. The need to repeat this process over and over makes demands on every kind of human relationship. The aim of sexual love, simulations of death and transfiguration, completely out of control. The little death is what Anonimo calls the genetic spasm, makes all things new again, or the spiritual equivalent of this release, making a clean breast of things. Pray, confess, unload sorrow by giving up all dignity and pretense, die to your pride, as in the Roman Catholic rite, and gain a new beginning by means of absolution. More slowly, psychoanalysis too aims to break apart, to kill the unit of resistance lying on the couch, forcing it to die in itself before healing can begin. What compels men at intervals to move into a different kind of time, and to dissolve and resemble the self, accounts as will be seen for humanity's worldwide dependence on plays, film, and games. Members of an audience, Aristotle knew, vicariously die, purged, and then renewed by pity and terror, and also laughter. In the same way, small deaths and rebirths occur in the imagination, depending on whether we win or lose a game, how our team fares, or whether the ball lands on the red or black. Through history, the sensation of being reborn has been achieved in spectacular fashion by violence, between individuals and gangs, and by tribes and nations in violence's massive form, war. Aggression forces men to die a little in risking disaster. The conflict will naturally have other reasons why. Sometimes it will be thrust upon us when, at the moment, we ourselves have no need for such cleansing action. We attack others or violently defend ourselves to preserve integrity, to extend power, to extend power and being, to possess their turf, wealth, women, to protect ours, and so on. Yet, as often as not, persons and tribes may be found inventing a threat, picking a fight, for no special reason. This arbitrary malevolence. This arbitrary malevolence can be understood only if it is seen that, quite apart from the motives of self-protection and conquest, the combative man is also driven by the compulsion to be born again. Violence will do it, shaking and disarranging the psyche. The risk can make all of life seem fresh and thrilling. For example, black riots in Los Angeles, New York, Detroit, and other cities have been motivated by a hierarchy of reasons: resistance to injustice, retaliation for damaged manhood, tactical aims to crowd and press the white establishment, sheer frustration, and, on a Dionysian level, the joy of running wild. But behind the proud and gleeful faces of the rioters, the raging contingencies, the expressions of abandon, greed and hatred, the contempt and derisive laughter can be detected in the face of people desperate to be reborn. An unfortunate awareness has overtaken our species. Masses of men and women everywhere no longer believe that they have even the slightest chance of living beyond the grave. The unbeliever pronounces a death sentence on himself. For millions, this can be not merely disconcerting, but a disastrous perception. Like accident victims showing no visible abrasion, those who have lost the dream of immortality sustain a grave internal injury. Viscerally and in the very impulses of the nervous system, they have always felt rebirth waiting on the other side. Now that it no longer waits there, the rhythmic imitation of immortality, lived out from day to day, is being disrupted. With the prospect of survival denied him, the unbelieving man, who may outwardly perhaps fool himself, still be professing some kind of faith, tends to become emotionally cornered and thrown back into his doubtful self. Sexual and confessional release still help, but are harder to come by. Without hope of rebirth, confession is far less satisfying. One dissolves before a blank universe and returns to it. There will be no authority for renewal except another's heart, which may be somewhere else with its own troubles. The prospect of oblivion has also resulted for many in an impairment of sexual grace, loss of faith in the body. Hence, mass atheism troubles the sensuality of millions. Rhythms of desire that assume everlasting life now break against the new unbelief, and sexual energy takes contrived and lunging forms, seeking to force eternity. Loving eternity becomes more important than loving another. Sensuality may turn off altogether. Continue half-heartedly, or begin a feverish hunt for rebirth. In carrying on this search, men and women depend increasingly on sexual symbolism. The sexual partner turns into a stand-in for various dream figures, phantasms, in a stage-managed resurrection. These figures, father, mother, brute, victim, Amazon, master, slave, child, disciple, are all agents of immortality, to be conquered or succumbed to many times over, in order that the pilgrim without faith may symbolically die and live again. In consequence, the lover whose once immortal soul is gone does not so much possess his companion as his own dreams. The loved one's role becomes less that of being loved than one of assisting the other's desire to live on, a sort of sexual travel agent helping to arrange divine trips. For this reason, stage sexuality with props and fetishes has become commonplace. Orgies, wife swaps, and the like, more popular than ever among groups of quite ordinary people, represent a mass assault on the mortal barrier. Similarly, the rituals of sadism and masochism can be viewed as pseudo-religious ceremonies. The sadist plays a god, the masochist seeks renewal he cannot obtain otherwise through carefully arranged violence, worshipping an earthly god or goddess with absolute power over him. Each is trying to break through to lost immortality, and the same may be said of all of our sexual experimenters and outlaws. Anxiety increases with education, as we grow more sophisticated, which is to say more unnatural. Ever more ingenious rationalizations are needed to explain death away. Faith survives among intelligent people, but not so easily now. The devout must somehow manage to embrace absurdity or ignore it. The second comes much more naturally. Mens sana is still best maintained by not thinking about possibilities. Unhappily, with the immense input of information at our disposal today, a certain number of ideas destructive to peace of mind will be almost bound to penetrate one's protective screen. Meanwhile, a man's woman's blind desire to have no idea of what has happened to the spirit. They persist again in Freud's expression, behaving as if immortal. But the waking intelligence knows at this evolutionary moment that we have been self-hoaxed, that we will not, in fact, be reborn in another world or return to this one. The confrontation between unbelief and desire has turned into an emotional high noon, irresistible cellular push to live on meets brute, unmoving fact that you will not. Vision of immortality falls apart. Deprived of rebirth vision, men suffer recurring spells of detachment, with either violence or apathy to follow. And so the twin detachments of violence and apathy, side by side, are growing stronger and advancing within us. Institutionalized violence, not only against others, but against all of nature, the bringer of death, multiplies everywhere, bombing and polluting. Men commit massive aggressions against everything, earth, air, water, countryside, as if hoping to bring existence itself down on their heads. Violence against our own mortal nature leaps out of the television screen, into the living room, out the door and into the neighborhood. At the smallest provocation, people spill out on the streets, overturning all forms in the way. Their message is, since life has let us down, smash it. Between man and man, aggression has changed markedly in character, becoming more frequently random, flunky, and even as laughter attends killing, a source of amusement. Atheism without hope has fathered this viciously creative effort to try divine privilege on for size and reducing or destroying another for no particular reason. The mild twin, apathy, grows from a deliberate reduction of consciousness, which doesn't care to deal with the unknown anymore. One finds solace and safety in repetition, hours of torpor in front of a television set, and the like. The much despised reflexes of conformity still prevalent in middle-class American life are part of this withdrawal. In extreme form, apathetic reactions to life's uncertainty and pain lead to narcotic refuge. A horrible miscalculation, since narcotics set one free of city time, but adrift without rebirth. Worse, on the other side of the dissolve, and nods there awaits nothing but a further craving. Into the wasteland came riding about 20 years ago, Eastern wisdom, passing en route, Western philosophy going the other way to inspire the newly materialistic Asians. Buddhist thought offered new hope to what were at first relatively small groups of younger Americans. Asian masters taught the disciples that lead to a sincerity. Okay, let me reread that sentence. Asian masters taught the disciplines that lead to sincerity. yield up the frightened, grasping self, that which suffers. For resurrection and the hope of eternal life substitutes Sicilic existence within the great wheel of being. Live with all of our senses wide awake, particularly eternally now. The Buddhist outlook, acquired as it must be by profound effort, the effort not to try, would probably have remained with a few thousand adepts had it not have been for Dr. Albert Hoffman's accidental discovery in 1938 of the mind-opening properties of lysergic acid and ergot, synthesized in 1943 as LSD-25. In the 1950s, there were followed banker Gordon Wasson's research with Mexican mushrooms. Reports of wondrous visions led to the production of LSD and psilocybin, publicity for peyote, the rise of Timothy Leary, prophet of psychedelic revelation, inevitable prohibition of the materials, then, of course, bootlegging. All at once it became possible for any American high school boy to gaze into the mysteries visible before only to sages, saints, and madmen. Visions once earned by going without sleep, fasting, and motionless contemplation could now be summoned up chemically by real estate salesmen and grocery clerks. Today's proclaimed revolution of consciousness among the young middle-class masses has only just begun. It is going to continue indefinitely. There will be no way to halt the distribution of psychedelic chemicals, because these substances are the stuff of what passes for revelation. They have provided a new means of attaining simulated rebirth, just at a time when the old ones were giving out. In sufficient strength, LSD and similar preparations, assuming, say, with LSD, a dosage of 300 micrograms, nearly always, on one trip or another, recapitulates the process of having a fall, coming apart, and being put back together again. Although experiences along the way are different each time, and unique for each traveller, the form of the voyage is likely to follow a predictable flight plan, with a symbolized reenactment of death and rebirth occurring at some point. Authorities labouring to control the misuse of LSD should understand this. The acid trip is a quest for instant renaissance in a society whose orthodox avenues to immortality are all but closed. Whether realizing it or not, the psychedelic rebel turns his back on death, confronted by meaninglessness. He blows his mind, the apparatus perceives death. The startling correlation between mysteries of the Himalayas, such as the soul's journey described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and those uncovered by psychedelic materials, supports the possibility that an incessant and rhythmic propulsion towards rebirth may be mankind's strongest motivating force. The chemically released journey also reveals not merely a flaw, but a horror at the center of unformed existence, where the cosmic soul is supposed to be. Eastern wisdom holds that a return to the individual consciousness is undesirable. In the LSD rerun of the soul's orbit, those who are not synthetically reborn, who fail to complete chemical samsara, do not come back, and in many instances remain permanently out of their minds. In short, the only way not to be reborn is to split, fragment, and remain in pieces. But if the pieces of your mind do not come together again, the currently fashionable ideal of fragmentation resolves into a horrible condition. The unreborn individual remains inside a wrapping with cracks in it. There can be nothing much more terrible than to remain in this diffuse state of being. Only the sensation of being born again brings the victim or the remote, smiling child back to unitary consciousness. The psychedelic lesson informs us that rebirth is all. Supposedly profound men who glorify the diffusion of consciousness with no re-emergence of the self in view are recommending that humanity conquer death by going mad. If men long and plan to live forever, how to explain suicide? In part, as a rebirth project, an attempt to reach an exalted state of being, and also, as Dostoevsky revealed through Kirillov, an act of God imitation. Thoughts of suicide begin to occur when accustomed patterns of death, rebirth simulation break down or go awry. The depressed individual no longer has the means to shed his fatigued, used-up self. Hope and enthusiasm, which can be only made new by repeated imitations of rebirth, no longer carry him forward. He imagines splitting off, getting away from the old self he cannot be reborn from. He may then reach the stage of being beside himself in emotional fission. The action need not be purely mental. For instance, a physically afflicted man may be moved to the split off from himself by form-breaking and identity-breaking pain. Suicide will then be the only way to kill the pain, but not necessarily the self now enduring it. Doctors identify gradations of contemplated suicide. Some distracted individuals really intend to take their lives. Others partly intend it, while others still others have in mind only the form of self-destruction. Contrary to Camus, suicide has never been the one truly serious philosophical problem. It is not a problem, but a commitment, and commonly beyond that, an act of faith. For those who really intend to close out their identities, this commitment is the most despairing in the human psyche, the willingness to act on an utter loss of faith in the possibilities of rebirth. Suicide as a positive act of faith, through physically accounting to the same thing, springs from hope, a last-ditch measure to destroy mortality, to rise above your condition, to dissolve life here before it dissolves you, and in terminal defiance to realize the fantasy of continuation elsewhere. Killing oneself in this way takes place within the framework of resurrection. In The Logic of Suicide, Edwin S. Shieldman and Norman L. Fairbairn discover in the suicidal state of mind a confusion of the selves. They distinguish I naught from the self imagined by others from I sigma, the inward I. The suicide says, in effect, I naught will get attention. That is, certain other people will cry, go to a funeral, sing hymns, relive memories and the like. But he also implies or states that even after death, I sigma will go through these experiences. That is, I will be cried over, I will be attended to, as though the individual would be able to experience these occurrences. In Suicide in Scandinavia, Dr. Herbert Hendon notes that the act of dying itself can be conceived as pleasurably incorporated into a reunion fantasy. Most frequently, the emphasis is not placed on the dying, but on the gratification to follow. He recalls a 47-year-old woman whose fantasy of being united with her first lover could only be realized in an attempt to kill herself. Another man sought to join his wife, who had just died. A woman failed in her attempt at suicide, but lost her leg under a train. Hypnosis shortly after the event brought out the dream of a long, narrow tunnel with light at the end of it, her father and mother standing in the light as Joseph and Mary, and she, the Christ child, reborn a boy. Gregory Zilborg found varied immortality fantasies among suicidal patients. Don D. Jackson summarizes Zilberg's view that suicide is a way of thwarting outside forces that are making life impossible. Another aspect is the paradoxical effect of living by killing oneself. This is one method of gaining immortality and fame, thus maintaining the ego rather than destroying it. Finally, suicide results from the excess of isolation. the inability to reach out and touch another, or be touched, or have it mean anything. One of the two states of mind precedes the act. First, the sharpening of the moment, an intolerable sharpening of perception which reveals edges to all things, and which, in turn, leads to intensified awareness of things being separated, as if enlarged by a microscope. Life before one's eyes take on an unbearable clarity, and one is suspended in the clarity with no means of escape. The impulse may also come from precisely the opposite visual distortion, frequently participated. The impulse may also come from precisely the opposite visual distortion, frequently precipitated by drinking. This is a sensation of miasmic glory. The inner and outer world become misty and seem to merge. According to Dr. C.A. Wall, suicide is a magical act. This dispersion of consciousness reproduces the outlook of all-powerful infancy, a state in which all problems are solvable. The suicide achieves, as does the infant, a kind of cosmic identification. Killing oneself in this way is selective and arranged death, looking forward to transfiguration. Suicide sheds the body, the dying part, enabling the distressed person to break free from an impossible scene. He aims to lose consciousness and to have it at the same time. Suicidal man claims the privilege of overseeing his own total loss. Remaining superior to the act, he can project the fantasy of being able to live beyond his earthly self. The ribbon of fantasy unreels beyond the prospect of death. Thus the voluntary end of life begins as an assertion. It implies godlike control over both the exit and subsequent re-entry. Suicide controls and dictates death as if to a stenographer. Masterminding one's end assumes mastery of some future renaissance. The Dionysian self-destroyer envisions a round-trip ticket, and since death intervenes, he will not be disappointed. A third element can be found in the suicidal passion. In an interview with Gene Stein for the Paris Review series Writers at Work, William Faulkner said, "Life is motion." He went on, "The aim of every artist is to arrest motion, which is life, by artificial means, and hold it fixed so that 100 years later, when a stranger looks at it, moves again, since it is life. Since man is mortal, the only immortality possible for him is to leave something behind him that is immortal, since it will always move. This is the artist's way of scribbling 'Killjoy was here' on the wall of the final and irrevocable oblivion through which he must someday pass." But this compulsion drives others as well as professional artists. In clumsy ways, it can be the project of all kinds of people to give their lives some kind of dramatic form, so that, life being motion, they will not move again. To give their lives some kind of dramatic form, so that, life being motion, they will move again. Every suicide, then, in all its intended despair, attempts a final work of art. The conquering victim, in the planning, duration, and execution of his project, plays the role of an artist seeking immortality. Therefore, the interior processes governing suicide will never be explained any more than the imaginative breakthroughs of an artist can be accounted for. We only know that each is striving to live again in his own way. Berdyaev, the Russian Orthodox mystic, has a disturbing conviction that the death of the body assures everlasting life of the soul, and that the life of the body, if eternal, would assure the death of the soul. Does this help account for the willingness of men to cripple and kill themselves and others in order to live forever?